different method, same intentions. But new formed groups like West Indians for the first time in records were meeting their infamous African cousins who only knew about each other via false informations. You
and then said African, they said we are slavery.
Well, those Indians are criminals anyway.
Only a few knew better, were happy to see each other. Former Marcus Garvey followers and Pan-Africanist soldiers who were joining together to fight white colonizers. While West Indians were sent to do the grimy jobs upon the Windrush, most Africans were students around the time of pre-independence, couldn't wait to board the ships or plane to go back home for the return leg and participate in the experience of total independence until they received that dreaded correspondence.
Kofi, I can't believe it. You see, there's been a coup. And Nkrumah will no longer be sending for you. So you're going to have to survive and do what you have to. Remember us, remember me, remember I love you.
What the hell's Kofi supposed to do? See, the one thing in life worse not knowing what to do is to have your whole life's purpose taken away from you. I keep telling this generation, we should bathe in the wisdom of our elder men and women, for they've experienced a feeling I've yearned for since the beginning of my conscious education, and that's the complete feeling of total liberation against Caucasian directions. But Africans were soon joined by others fleeing their nations, hoping in blind faith for a better existence. So doctors, engineers and civil servants were forced to do jobs below their qualifications. You see, regardless of our cultures, as soon as we arrived, they all despised us. Bloody bastards couldn't even find us decent houses. Imagine this, seeing a sign upon a notice, no Irish, blacks or dogs are accepted. Or if they are, then you accept the overcrowding. Like ants in boxes or crabs in a barrel. Overcrowded areas from Brixton to Grove. Riots with white folks on Latimer Road, while MPs like Enoch Pryor was prophesying that rivers of blood will flow. So blacks were afraid to go places where white supremacists live, for they're waging war against black residences. So-called working class brothers, what on earth do we do to you? All we wanted was to walk down the streets with you, living in distance with you. But our parents went to work among songs of go home, you bloody was, you're not welcome here. But we believed in the triumph of the human nature, and soon they'll start seeing us as equal human partners. So we wasted too much time never doing for self, and our youths are growing up needing our specialist help, and that can't be provided by the system of somebody else. Meanwhile, Asians came over, kept their cultures and built their own empires, then joined pre-existing black organizations just in case integration was smarter. See, a wise man always has a backup plan. Keep your culture, you develop it further. But Caribbeans didn't even work with each other, much less Africans. See, Africans didn't work with each other, much less Caribbeans. The only thing they had in common was they taught nothing to their children, teaching them it's better to be British in this climate of racial hatred. Strange fruit, growing on trees without roots, filled with irregular content, watching their parents' development in new neglected ghetto environments. See, right from the beginning, these children were doomed, for society fed them seeds of rejection through their womb, and they tasted flavor or subhuman behavior, seeing their strong fathers reduced to subhuman.
Next, you can't do nothing, right? Yes,
yes, sir.
Sorry, sir. Me work fast. I really need a job here.
Zombies and skeletons of their former past glories. See, these children inherited seeds of self-destruction. The misplaced generation, the missing children of Eden, stuck in all areas of Great Britain, referring to the regions as their lost and found kingdoms. Though there was a time some of them were eagerly seeking solutions, believing Boateng, Abbott or Grant couldn't do what was needed. So they formed organizations operating outside the systems, appealing to the young ones with a new code of conduct, informing them that the government cared nothing for us. They wouldn't even allow us to get acquainted with the best black leaders. This was back in my youth, where bow ties and slick suits with plans for black youth would convince us to convert us, that God owed us a promise, handing out leaflets in the worst neighborhoods. Brothers, sisters, you ain't been forgotten. Why don't you come to the meeting on the weekend if you want more information? Strange, cause nowadays I don't even see him. See, it's hard to live righteous in a world that's not for us. So nowadays it's even scarier to look inside the eyes of the youth in our areas. The man that says fuck this, cause no man can save us. And I'll be damned if I'm punk like my elders, cause nowadays prison or death don't even scare us. And I guarantee you retaliation if there's another Stephen Lawrence. From running from white folks to running after white folks, to running with white folks, working class foes to crew fellows. 20 years ago your boy would have bombed your house full of petrol. But forget it, cause all that shit is now historic. And this is the present, where so-called urbanites apparently face similar shit, cause blacks, whites and Asians infected with black commercial so-called culture. So they call it urban. So now you have everything but the burden, cause for most this life is just too damn grimy. Though we cope, cause it's the only hole most have ever known. So we cope, afraid to even dream of better. We're now walking streets in Union Jack sweaters, British or black British, without an aim or a purpose, or understanding of their cultures. Killer looks inside the iris, walking road unopposed with a mentality that's murderous. Strange, cause just half a generation past, his older brother got opposition when he raised his black flag. See, they cared nothing for us. Complete areas depleted into ghettos where elder white folks would soon let you know it wasn't always like this, you know, before them colours moved in. Used to be a picture-perfect environment. No offence. Before blacks arrived with no finance, looked for homes with no assistance, education with no inclusion, qualification without jobs, alienated in areas overpopulated. See, low economics can get the worst from us in a society that supposedly wants the best for us. While the BNP flourish, Farrakhan is still banished. See, we're all alone, and ain't no man can save us. Psycho spirits of past warriors who subconsciously grows within us. So soldiers on road know they've been through the worst history can throw. So if you think you're hard enough, then do your best to get us. If not, then leave us to live murderous. A mentality unknown to the generations of old. From short man's eulogy to Nolan's cold and road. Cause can't no man reach us, cause ain't no one ever loved us. So how can you expect to save us? Generations of past Africans causing turmoil inside us. So who knows what the story holds for tomorrow? But for the generation of old, that's gone and passed. From ashes to ashes, to dust to dust. But for the new generation and direction of black Britons, in Almighty God we trust.
Change is coming. Change is coming. Believe that change is coming. Generation.
Tender and warrior, peace and blessings, kings and queens. My name is ShakaRa, and welcome to this brief Black History Month workshop entitled Black History Month is Dead. And yeah, as you can see on the promotion, the statement actually has a question mark on it. So I'm actually asking a question, yeah? I am by no means suggesting that Black History Month is actually dead. Just to give a little background to this presentation, it actually stems from a presentation that was developed by my father, Brother Leader Bandaka, in which he was actually breaking down the history of Black History Month. In fact, that particular workshop is entitled The History of Black History Month. And so in developing on his work, what I really wanted to do was look, using the foundation of the history of Black History Month, look into what Black History Month actually means to us in the present day. So in 2018 and beyond, what it means culturally within the society that we're in, and how that culture affects or reflects the identity that we have as black people living in the UK, and what we produce, the history that we're going to be producing out of that cultural and identity orientation. And so yeah, you know what I mean, that's what we're going to do today. So welcome. This is hopefully going to be the first in a few broadcasts that I'm going to be doing live via YouTube during the Black History Month season. So do stay tuned, lick that subscribe button and that bell, you know what I'm saying, should you be so moved. And I look forward to you joining me again, you know what I mean. So let's go forward into the presentation right about now, and I'm just going to outline for you some of the key questions that we're going to be addressing for the next hour or so. And so the first question we're going to be, well, some of the questions that we're going to be looking at are, why do we allow them to give us a month to celebrate our history? We're addressing that question because this is a common misconception surrounding Black History Month. Every year Black History Month comes around and people ask the question, why do we allow them to give us a month to celebrate our history? And so by the end of this presentation, I do hope that those who say that will no longer say that again, because it's a fallacious statement. The question is based upon a faulty premise, yeah? That premise being that somebody, i.e. them, gave us something to celebrate our history. That also comes with statements like, I don't celebrate Black History Month because I don't need a month to celebrate history. I celebrate my history every day, yeah? And you know what I mean? So, and that statement kind of presupposes that the people that, you know, developed Black History Month intended for us to confine the observance and celebration of our history into this period called a month, and not look at it again after that or outside of that period of time. So we're going to address that also to the extent that that is true or false. Another question that we're going to be answering is Black History Month about celebrating African American history? So because Black History Month began in America, the idea is that there's a overrepresentation of African history as it applies, yeah, or the history of African people as it applies to those of us in America, yeah, specifically the United States of America. And so whether it's just designed to solve that problem, we're addressing that partly because Africans who live in predominantly African countries, countries that have a predominant population of African people or black people, have suggested, some Africans in such countries, for example Jamaica, have suggested that there is no need for a Black History Month in places like Jamaica because, you know, basically it's a majority black country. We don't need the self-esteem, so to speak, that is required in places where we are a minority. Yeah, so we're going to address that question. How does Black History Month reflect black identity? So we're going to be looking at the role that Black History Month plays in affirming, reaffirming, defining the black identity in the UK. And globally for that matter. And also finally, what is the proper usage of history? So I'm going to give you a few examples, yeah, relating to how people, what things that people are doing today in the historical field, yeah, the history that we're creating today, and also from a domestic kind of UK perspective and a global perspective, and also how history can be used to solve very real problems, yeah, relating to the sojourn of black African people in 2018 and beyond. So I always like to define terms, yeah, when I'm doing presentations, because we don't always assume that people know what we're talking about or that we have a shared understanding of what we're talking about. So we're going to define history first and foremost, so you know where I'm coming from in terms of a definition of history and what history is before we go forward. I'm going to start by giving you the Oxford Dictionary, this definition, because you know Oxford is the authority on all things to do with the English language and its definition. So history, as defined by the Oxford Dictionary, has three primary definitions. The first of which is the study of the past events. The study of past events, particularly in human affairs. Yeah, the study of past events, particularly in human affairs. And the second definition is the whole series of past events connected with a particular person or thing. So an example of using that history in that particular context would be the history of Rome. Yeah, it's the whole series of events connected with Rome, yeah, or the whole sequence of events connected with Monomotapa, yeah, empire in southern Africa, you know, for example, all right. And third, we have a continuous, typically chronological record of important or public events or of a particular trend or situation. I'll read that one more time. A continuous, typically chronological record of important or public events or of particular trend or situation. The history of hip hop, yeah, might be an example of using that particular, you know, terminology in this particular context, yeah. You know what I mean? All things have a history, okay? Now, these definitions are all well and good. They're pretty, you know, well defined in the very basic sense, yeah. But I'm suggesting that these definitions are very detached, yeah, from an actual practical application for history. And I believe that the fact that history is defined in this way is the reason why many of us are estranged, yeah, from history, find a lack of worth in the study of history, and therefore are adverse to learning history. Yeah, many of us growing up in school, you know, we would say things like, well, why do I need to learn that? Yeah, what's the purpose of learning this thing called history? Yeah, and doing workshops and going into schools, you still find that mentality among young people today, especially black African young people. And so this definition is not enough. It's not sufficient, yeah, for I and I to move forward with in terms of understanding black or African history. All right. So in order to find better workable definitions, I'm going to use two scholars, all right? The first of which is my teacher. He goes by the name of Robin Walker, all right? And he says history in its broadest sense contains all knowledge not acquired in the present. History in its broadest sense contains all knowledge not acquired in the present. what he's emphasizing there is the fact that everything in creation has a history. All right. You know, this related to me because in my teachings growing up as a child, particularly from my father, he would teach us in this way. Everything has a history. Yeah. And Robin Walker in particular is explaining the fact that all subjects, yes, in our education have a history also. So when we study mathematics, we are not just studying the principles as it associates as associated with numbers, yes, and quantities and calculation. We are actually studying the history of these principles as it applies to particular people. In this context, we're talking about Britain, or more broadly, Europe. The progress of European civilization as it relates to mathematics is what we're actually studying. Yes, an example of this would be the fact that there's a theorem called Pythagoras theorem. Yes, science. We are studying the Pythagoras is an individual. Yes, that is important in European history. Therefore, the theory is named after him. Yes, Newton's laws. Yes, science. Newton's laws. Yeah, it's named after Newton because Newton is the person who introduced that into Europe. Yes, but these principles existed, yeah, and theories existed in other places in the world, in different cultures, whereby they don't know who Pythagoras is or Newton is. So we wouldn't define it as Newton's laws or Pythagoras laws, yeah, or Pythagoras theorem. These are just two examples, yes, because the name that the principles that are given, yeah, is defined by the important figures in the history of the people who are defining it. Yes, that's just the reality of the situation. So we're studying what we are taught in the British education system is actually the history of these various disciplines and subjects as it relates to Europe in general and Britain in particular. Yes, you know, when we study African history, for example, we learn that the Yoruba had a counting system, yeah, the way of writing and saying numbers or quantities, yes, that would require you to be a mathematician, all right, to be able to say numbers, yeah, in the Yoruba counting system. Very, very deep, yeah. And so it's different. It's a far more complex system, numbering system, but what it teaches you in terms of calculation, basically saying numbers in the Yoruba counting system actually teaches you calculation. That doesn't exist in, you know, the counting system that we know. We just say 1, 2, 3, 4, and we associate the quantities with those words 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, it's a different thing. All right, so we have to understand that mathematics, as it develops in different cultures in the world, doesn't always develop in the same way because it has a history. That's what Robin Walker is defining. All knowledge. So when you define history as all knowledge not acquired in the present, it means that you therefore broaden your understanding of history immediately. You're applying history to everything. Yes, it's all knowledge. So whatever you want to learn, you have to engage history. That is a much more functional definition, yeah, of history as applied by the master teacher Robin Walker. But we're going to go to the grandmaster teacher now, yeah, to define history further for us, the grandmaster teacher Baba John Henry Clark. And he says history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells a people where they have been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells a people where they still must go and what they still must be. And we're going to focus in on the metaphoric usages there. First of all, history is a clock. We understand the usage of a clock. It tells us the time of day. Therefore, we know our place where we are in relation to the history of the world, or our people, or ourselves as individuals, based upon our knowledge of our history. Yeah, think of the usage of a clock. Yeah, we organize our day via the time that we find on our clock. Before we had clocks and watches and all these kinds of things, we would use the sun. We would organize our day via the sun. Yes, and the sun, time is really the measurement of the movement of the sun in relation to our planet. Yes, as it regards time, the clock, and these things. Yeah, it's very, very serious thing. So it's how we organize, yes, our collective and personal selves. All right. He also says it is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. All right. Interesting use of metaphor there. I find it very functional once again, yeah? What's a compass? A compass, yeah, is a device that charts north. It points north, and from north we can therefore see where south, east, and west is in relation to north. It is a device that is used, yeah, to navigate, plan a journey. Okay, if we're here and we want to get to a destination, we would use a compass in order to chart the journey to that destination. Right? So, given that now, what he's saying is, history is not just about studying the past, as we heard from Oxford. Yes? History is about finding our place in the present. Yes? Finding our place in the present in order to chart our journey from where we are in the present to where we want to be in the future. Yeah? When I work with young people, the example that I always give is the idea of, if I'm on a ship in the Atlantic Ocean and you are on a ship in the Pacific Ocean and we are both trying to get to Africa, will the compass that I have in the location that I am in be useful to you? And will the compass that you have in the location that you are in be useful to me? No, you have to use your own compass, and I have to use my own compass in order for us to even get to the same place. Yeah, very important. Yeah, very important. Especially because we're talking about Black history, and the term Black in Black history or Black History Month, yeah, presupposes the idea that there is a collective and shared experience among people who are called Black. And so the term that I want to introduce into the discourse, into these definitions, yes, is collective memory. Memory, collective memory. We all operate in our daily lives based upon our memory, the memory that we have. We have learned things yesterday and we are only able to recall them and in order to be in our daily lives by having a memory. Yes, so when we leave our house, our homes, we have to we know how to get back to our homes because we have a memory. All right, and so history is the collective memory bank. The history of a people is the collective memory bank of that people. And the issue is that as Black people, as African people, or defined as people of African heritage, our collective memory bank was stolen, was robbed from us through an event that is popularly known as slavery. All right. Before we go any further, we want to just emphasize this last sentence. Most importantly, history tells a people where they still must go and what they still must be. Why? Because we are going to be returning to that particular principle at the end of the presentation, where we are going to be discussing the primary proper usages of history. Okay, so going forward, we're going to introduce this man into our workshop today, and he goes by the name of Carter G. Woodson, more properly Dr. Carter G. Woodson. This man is the founder, the father of Black History Month. Yeah, and it's amazing to me that many times, yeah, Black History Month comes along and the name of Carter G. Woodson is rarely mentioned. Yeah, many people involved in Black History Month celebrations and observances are unaware of the fact that it was founded by Carter G. Woodson. That is changing now because people are to raise his profile, say his name even more, so we give thanks for that. But there's still more work to be done here. So we're going to begin at looking at the life and legacy of Carter G. Woodson. As you can see here, he's the father of Black History Month, and he's also notable for being the second African to have achieved a PhD from Harvard University, which he done in 1912. And just as a point of terminology, when I say African, I'm referring to all Black people, okay? So there's no confusion there. As the great musician Peter Tosh said, no matter where you come from, as long as you're a Black man or a Black woman, you're an African. And so I hope I don't have to define, explain further for anybody right about that, just so you know what I mean. All right, so Carter G. Woodson is an African in the United States of America, and he achieved a PhD in 1912. Now, understanding that this was the era of pro and lynchings in the United States of America, where Black men and women and children could be killed by mobs of white men in and out of uniform just for being Black. Yeah, and the brutality that was being faced by Africans in America during this period was thoroughly grotesque. All right, to the extent that some even compare it, yeah, to what we were suffering during slavery, and slavery was supposed to have ended at this point, okay? But Carter G. Woodson, developing as an educated African, achieved a PhD in that era. So therefore, you must appreciate how brilliant he must have been, yeah, to achieve this within the context of America at that time. Time doesn't allow for us to go more into that, so we're going to move forward and just explain the fact that Carter G. Woodson founded a number of institutions. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History is one, which he founded in 1915. It is now called the Association for the Study of African American Studies. Yeah, and he also founded, under the auspices of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, the Journal of Negro Life and History, yeah, which is a publication, all right, in 1916. He actually founded as well this institution called the Associated Publishers Press, so that he actually had his own publishing company, okay? Now, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History was really just an institution set up and established to study the history of African people. They began really studying the history of black people in America, yeah, looking at the things that Africans in America had contributed to American society. Obviously, that train of study would eventually lead them to Africa, studying the sojourn of Africans from Africa to America and the history of African people in Africa, yeah? So much of the information that was developing around this time about the history of Africans in Africa was coming from people like Carter G. Woodson, people like Arthur Schomburg, people like J.A. Rogers, yeah? But Carter G. Woodson is foremost among the names that were mentioned. And so these brothers and sisters at the time begin to learn about all of this history of African people, which we won't be going into today, yeah, because that is more in the History of Black History Month presentation, all right? So we're just going to explain the fact that what they began to realize was not that only that Africa had a history, but that Africa has the oldest history of all places on the planet Earth, and therefore African people have the oldest history of all people on the planet Earth. As the saying goes, before there was any history, there was black history, yes? And this image that you see here is the temple of Luxor in Kemet, also known as Egypt. And this temple was built over 1,000 years, yeah, BC, yes? You know what I mean? So we're talking about good 3,000 years ago at least, all right? This was built, okay? All right. Another saying that will explain what we're talking about at this particular moment: Africa is the birthplace of humanity and the cradle of civilization. We use this quote from Baba Asa Hilliard, yeah, a historian by the name of Asa Hilliard, to explain the fact that Africa is not only the birthplace of humanity, as in the first place that human beings can be found, yeah, on the planet Earth, but it is also the cradle of civilization, which means that what we call civilization, as in the advanced development, yeah, of human social order, all right, actually begins in Africa. Not only does it begin in Africa, but all people who develop civilization following this, yeah, actually, yes, develop it as a result of their association with Africa and African people, okay? We can justify this and prove this through the study of history. The number one book that breaks this down in this dispensation of time is written by my teacher Robin Walker, and it is entitled When We Rule. I encourage all ones and ones to you know, search and acquire this book and read anything. He has books. Read anything by Robin Walker. When We Rule is a particularly, you know, hard graft in terms of it's a very thick book and it's very detailed, but he has also written a number of books that actually condense a lot of the information as it relates to different subjects and different empires or nations on the continent, you know what I mean? So just check out Robin Walker, and what you see depicted here are two pieces of ancient Yoruba art, kings and queens, you know what I mean? So yeah, and we can look at these are made out of metals, yeah, like bronze and them kind of things there, and copper. So we can see the level of detail that are ancient Yoruba ancestors we're dealing with. Yeah, we have a misconception sometimes that we look at that we now that we've dealt with African history, we see the Nile Valley, yeah, and more specifically Kemet or Egypt as, you know, the original or the pinnacle of civilization. We go out and say Africa, the rest of Africa never had any civilization, never had any great achievements. Nothing could be further from the truth, kings and queens, and all that will be explained further in When We Ruled. So once again, I encourage you to get that book. But moving forward, Carter G. Woodson founded Negro History Week, yeah, in the year 1926. The second week in February, because Frederick Douglass, the great African leader and abolitionist, was born in the month of February. And so Carter G. Woodson, honoring Frederick Douglass, founds Negro History Week in the year 1926. But what I want to emphasize here is the fact that he founds Negro History Week in 1926. He is already over a decade into his organizing of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which is studying the history of black people 24/7, 365. So, Carter G. Woodson, in founding Negro History Week, never intended for the study of African people and the history of African people to be confined to that period of time. Yeah? Wanted to do, understanding that the history of African people, the collective memory of African people had been stolen from them, from us. He wanted to create a celebration, an observance, a holiday that would provide a focal point for studying and highlighting, yes, this history for the sake of our people. All people develop holidays around the things that are important to them. In fact, all holidays actually are celebrations of the history of a people's culture. And so for people who have been robbed of a knowledge of their history, they needed a holiday and an observance that actually accentuated and highlighted their history for them. Yeah? So we're studying in it 24/7, 365. This holiday just allows a focal point for us to delve deeper into it even more. Yes? And have events around that study. Yeah? And invite others to come and learn what we have been studying. Okay? Each one teach one, and these kinds of things. The other thing that I want to highlight is the use of the word Negro. This was the general terminology, particularly in America, but not exclusively, that was being used to refer to African people or black people of the time. But this we highlight because nowadays, in recent years, especially in the UK, Black History Month has become kind of a multicultural affair. Yeah? Because we have this term politically black, which incorporates and encompasses everybody who's non-white. Black History Month observances have followed suit in the sense of the fact that you have all kinds of cultural expressions that are not associated with the history and culture of Africa and African people. So I've been to Black History Month occasions or seen Black History Month occasions, particularly as they are presented by London boroughs, yeah, that contain Indian fashion show, dress fashion shows, and Chinese food. One I saw had an Irish dance, yeah, performance and them kind of things there, yeah. And to be fair, yeah, I have seen that less in recent years because I think people have kind of, you know, fought back against this thing, yeah. But it's still happening to some degree, and at the same time, at the time of this recording, the London boroughs, most of them have not put out their Black History Month program as yet. Alright, so we'll wait and see how that manifests itself. Now, what's the point I'm making? There's nothing wrong with Indian fashion, Indian food, Chinese food. There's nothing wrong with Irish dancing, alright? However, why do we need to be observing these cultural expressions during Black History Month? Yeah? Black History Month is designed to serve the purpose of highlighting the history of Africa and African people because it has been a history that has been diminished, degraded, yeah, through. We were taught that Africa was the dark continent and it never had a history. Yes? And the people coming from that continent were savages and barbarians. And African people growing up, yeah, throughout the enslavement period and following were indoctrinated with that understanding, yeah, and that history and that idea of themselves. And so developed an institution, a celebration to fight that particular perception. Alright? I grew up, born and raised in London, East London to be specific. All right, and there's a strong Asian community in East London. And so primary school, secondary school, we would have various assemblies and observances and days and lessons that would be acknowledging the history of these people. Yeah. So for example, we would, I recall in primary school learning about Rama and Sita. Yes. And, you know, we would be in school colouring in pictures of Rama and Sita, learning the history of Rama and Sita as it applies to Indian people. Guru Nanak. Yeah. We learned about Guru Nanak. In school, we made Chinese dragons, yeah, for Chinese New Year. All right, we learned about Eid, yes, and Ramadan, yeah, and the community in East London that were particularly celebrating Eid and Ramadan were the Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, all right. And so when it came to observing all of these celebrations, yeah, and observances, the people who of that community would be forefront, yes. And I wasn't learning about Akom for Noche, yeah, the prophet in Akan tradition, yeah, of West Africa, yes, during Rama and Sita time. All right, we didn't do workshops on Kwanzaa when Eid and Ramadan, yeah, was the topic of conversation, yeah, or learning and study. We didn't do those things. It was just respected that the people who this referred to, yeah, had a cultural observance, and we were going to learn that. Yes, their cultural space was respected. So why, in the context of Black History Month, do we place this politically black definition on it? And therefore, in the celebration that is designed to serve the purpose of highlighting the history and achievements of Africa and African people, we are now diminished in that because we want to add Indian dancing and Chinese food, and Irish dancing, them kind of things there to the team. All right, you know what I'm saying? Why does that need to take place? Yeah, no. This particular celebration has a history and serves a purpose, and that thing should be respected. Yeah, the term Negro, we were the only people that were referred to as Negro. So we know specifically who Black History Month was designed to serve. And we say that based upon a historical analysis of the thing. All right. So Carter G. Woodson, studying African history, writes a number of books, and this is very interesting because, as I said, he is the second black man, yeah, in America to have achieved a PhD from Harvard University, which is the top university in the United States of America. Harvard is to America what Oxford is to the UK. All right. But Carter G. Woodson writes a number of books. One, The Education of the Negro in 1919, The History of the Negro in 1922. His most famous book is The Miseducation of the Negro in 1933. And during that time, he was also a contributor to the newspaper called The Negro World, which is the primary publication of the organization of the Most Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, yeah, the UNIA-ACL, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and African Communities League, which was the #1 Black Power organization of that era. The point I'm highlighting here is the fact that Carter G. Woodson was not just a historian, but he was also contributing to the activism of his time. Marcus Mosiah Garvey was an avid student of history, and so therefore he learned a lot about African history, which he spoke and preached from his platform. He learned a lot about African history from people like Carter G. Woodson and others. Okay, so Carter G. Woodson was not just a historian or an academic, he was actually also an activist. All right, and so in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro, the man who achieved a PhD, yet only the second African to have done so, makes an appraisal of the impact of the education system on black people. He says, history shows that it does not matter who is in power. Those who have not learned to do for themselves and have to depend solely on others never obtain any more rights and privileges in the end than they did in the beginning. Yeah, this is him now giving an explanation, a definition of the function, the purpose of history. History shows, yes, that as black people, he's saying, we have to learn to do for ourselves. Yeah, because if we don't, we're never going to gain any more rights. So our rights are not going to come from campaigning and appealing to the logical or moral sensibilities of those who are oppressing us. We have to get up and do things for ourselves, yes? And one of the things that we have to do for ourselves is study, learn, write, and teach our own history. Okay, the man who is the second African in America to have achieved a PhD goes on to say in The Miseducation of the Negro, the same educational process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought that he is everything and has accomplished everything worthwhile, depresses and crushes at the same time the spark within the Negro, making him feel that race does not amount to much and never will measure up to the standards of other people. The Negro, thus educated, is a hopeless liability. Many things in that statement. The first is that what he is saying is that the educational process as it stands, not the study of history, but education in general, yes, reinforces the idea that Europe is the continent of light, yeah, that Africa is the continent of darkness, and Africa can only gain civilization through its contact with Europe and European people. Therefore, black people have not achieved anything, and the only way we can achieve anything, yes, is through our association with European people. The problem with that is that European people have historically oppressed us. Yeah, slavery, colonization, invasion, and so on and so forth. Alright, so the same educational process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought that he has accomplished everything, at the same time depresses, yes, us, because we don't feel like we've achieved anything. And so the purpose of establishing Negro History Week was to reverse that particular conditioning, to inspire us with the knowledge that we as black people have achieved many things, yes, and not only that, that we were the first to achieve anything. Powerful, yeah? But the last sentence is particularly important. He says, the Negro, thus educated, is a hopeless liability. Education is a process that is supposed to leave you at an advantage in the society that you're living in. You're supposed to leave the educational process, yeah, being better equipped to live a life within the society and make a life for yourself within the society that you're in. What Carter G. Woodson is saying is that actually education as it stands, specifically the American education system, specifically the British education system, has actually the opposite impact on black people. What he is saying, yeah, is that education actually leaves us at a disadvantage. Meaning, we are not leaving the education system equipped, yeah, with the knowledge that we have achieved, and therefore that we can achieve anything for ourselves. Yes, the Negro, thus educated, is a hopeless liability. This a statement was made by the second African to have achieved a PhD from the top university in America, and he is saying that the education system is not sufficient for equipping us with what we need to be able to do things for ourselves. He explains this further in probably his most famous quotation, which is, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. You do not have to tell him to stand here or go yonder. He will find his proper place and will stay in it. You do not need to send him through the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there is not a back door, he will cut one for his own special benefit. His education makes it necessary. Yeah, and then there I'm just, expounding upon what he said in the previous statement. So I won't delve into breaking that down any further, because I'm sure that speaks for itself. But all he's explaining is how the way in which education conditions our mind a certain way. I'd encourage everybody to read the book, The Miseducation of the Negro. It's very, very important. Yeah, but not only for quotes like these, but for the actual philosophical process which he goes through in explaining the retrogressive impact, yeah, that the education system has on us, and how we have to reverse that through doing for ourselves a knowledge of ourselves and building institutions for ourselves. So throughout this period now, Africans are beginning to study, learn, and teach about African history. And one of the most prolific teachers of the period is a woman by the name of Mary McLeod Bethune. Yeah, she's a teacher, she's an educator, she's also an actual institution builder. She started her own school, and I'm just flinging this quote in here because I found it very inspirational. She says, "I am my mother's daughter, and the drums of Africa still beat in my heart. They will not let me rest while there is a single Negro boy or girl without a chance to prove his worth." Yes? Powerful. This is the inspiration that she's taking from the knowledge of herself as an African woman. And so because she has developed self-worth through the knowledge of herself as an African woman, the drums of Africa beating in her heart, she wants to share that inspiration, yeah, and transmit that inspiration to the young boys and girls that she taught. And Mary McLeod Bethune was particularly prolific in the teaching of young women, yeah, at a time when European society in general did not take the education of women very seriously. This is a African woman educator coming up in that era, teaching black women and girls at that time. So we should honor, you know, the name and the work and the legacy of Mary McLeod Bethune. All right, so that's Negro History Week. How does Negro History Week in America become Black History Month in America? And again, Black History Month in America is celebrated in February. Okay, so Negro History Week was in February, the second week in February to be specific. Black History Month is also celebrated in February, yeah, the entirety of the month of February. This has to do with the history of the Black Power era in the United States of America, okay? During that era, yeah, Africans in America and worldwide for that matter discarded the term Negro, yes, and adopted the term or affirmed the term black in reference to ourselves, okay? We are talking about the era of Black Power, and so there are a number of people in this image here. I'm going to explain who all of them are. At the top left hand corner you see Kwame Ture, yeah, the man by the name of Kwame Ture. He is actually the father of Black Power. This is the man that popularized the term Black Power in a speech in 1966. He was one of the leading members of an organization called SNCC, yes. At the time, he was known as Stokely Carter, and later reclaimed the African name Kwame Ture, yeah, and I'm going to explain why that is in a second as we move forward, because we have to understand that during this era, the Black Power energy was not confined to the United States of America. Yes, this is the revolutionary era, yeah, around the black world, and Africans around the black world were actually connected in their various different movements. Yeah, so stay tuned as we explain that a little bit further. Opposite him on the far top right hand side, you see a man by the name of Maulana Karenga. Maulana Karenga was also, and his organization, the US organization, were also prominent in the Black Power era for the ideology of cultural nationalism. This is the school of thought, yeah, that was championed by Maulana Karenga and the US organization, that said that we are not just fighting for political and social and economic rights in America, but the key crisis in black life is the crisis of culture, the culture crisis, the crisis of views and values, yeah? And so what they're emphasizing is the fact we haven't just lost the right to work for ourselves, the right to be American citizens. We have actually lost our own culture. Our culture was stolen from us through the process of enslavement, colonization, conquest, slavery, and these kinds of things. And so part of our liberation, our freedom, comes from being able to relearn and reconnect with that history. Yeah, Maulana Karenga and the US organization were probably the most prominent cultural nationalists of the time, but they were not the only ones. Okay, but it's important to put them there because the history of the Black Power era is often told from the perspective of the Black Panther Party, and the Black Panther Party deserves all accolades that it can it receives. However, because there was differences of opinion between the Black Panther Party on the one hand, the US organization on the other hand, and the socialist camp of the Black Power movement in general, and the cultural nationalist camp of the Black Power movement in general, there were differences between these two. History is often taught with the bias of the Black Panther Party and those who were more leaning towards that side of the thing, alright? But the Black Panther Party are depicted here, a powerful, powerful legacy. Black Panther Party as founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, also in the year 1966, yeah? However, the original Black Panther Party was actually founded under the leadership of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and others under SNCC, yes? Prior to, okay? So that's the history of a brief history of the Black Panther Party right there. All of these people, yeah, were inspired by the two men that you see on the extremities at the bottom of this image, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Omowale, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Kwame Ture was seen as the link between the two because as a member of SNCC, he was a co-organizer of many of the marches, yeah, that Martin Luther King organized himself. Okay, so these two men worked very, very closely together. But Kwame Ture, as a student of both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, developed the ideology of Black Power. Okay, but the point is that this was an era of defined Black pride, dignity, and fighting for the rights, the liberation, the freedom of Black people. We also have depicted here a woman by the name of Ella Baker, who is the woman right next to Malcolm X, and she was a prominent woman activist of that particular era, noted because of her steadfast opposition to many of the philosophy, much of the philosophy that of the Martin Luther King wing of the civil rights movement, because she was a supporter of non-violence, all right? And she was a proponent of collective leadership and activism and them kind of things there. And when many of the elder activists would not support the younger activists in terms of the more radical element, the Black Power element, Ella Baker was one of the elder women who supported the young people in their more radical organizational efforts. So honor to Mama Ella Baker. And next to her, you have the woman by the name of Assata Shakur, who is a stalwart of the Black Power era. She was a member of the Black Panther Party. She eventually left and joined the Black Liberation Army and the Republic of New Africa. And these institutions played the role in terms of bringing a closer tie between the different factions of the Black Power movement. So they were bringing together, really, their ideology brought together the radical politicization of the Black Panther Party with the revolutionary cultural orientation of the cultural nationalist, yes? And so very important that we know about these kinds of history. Assata Shakur herself was actually one of many activists of that time who was forcibly imprisoned under the forced charges of killing a police officer, and she eventually escaped from prison, broke out of the jail, and now resides in Cuba. All right, so we love Assata Shakur for that example right there. We're going to move on very quickly. So the point is now, during this era of heightened Black activism, Black people were redefining ourselves, our culture, our identity. Done away, yes, rejected the term Negro and looked in the mirror and saw pride and dignity in our image, yeah, and so developed the term Black, yes, as the primary identification for ourselves. Black and African, to be honest, but Black was the more popular terminology because we said Black pride and Black power and Black dignity, yes. And two of the prominent artists of the era, Mama Nina Simone, yeah, the high priestess of soul. She's a fantastic soul, jazz, and blues musician. One of the most unique voices that you've ever created. Mama Nina Simone, love her to bits. Yeah, done a song. Yeah, wrote a song called "Young, Gifted, and Black." And James Brown. Yeah, say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. These were just two of the anthems. Yeah, of that era. I put them here just to explain and emphasize the fact that we were now using this term Black. Yeah, as a terminology of pride and dignity. All right, but as I said, this revolutionary era was not confined to the United States of America. Right, many of the brothers and sisters during that era from America were actually traveling to the continent of Africa. And for example, the reason why dashiki became the symbolic fashion dress of the Black Power era, because people were bringing dashikis to America, and Africans also from the continent were traveling to America, and Africans were connecting around the globe, So we're going to begin here by talking about Asaje for Kwame Nkrumah, because the independence of Ghana in 1957, March 1957, was a very inspirational event, for Black Power activists in the United States of America. In fact, some of them actually traveled. Martin Luther King, for example, traveled to Ghana. Many people don't know that, There's actually a picture of Martin Luther King with Kwame Nkrumah. All right, Martin Luther King actually traveled to Jamaica and made a pilgrimage to the grave of the most honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Also, all right, and so Kwame Nkrumah, became one of the key inspirational figures of the Black world at that time. There's an artist by the name of Lord Kitchener, who, after the independence of Ghana, wrote a song. This is a man from Trinidad, a calypsonian from Trinidad, who wrote a song called "Ghana is the Name." Ghana is the name we wish to proclaim, and you know what I'm saying, he said something like, "We will be happy, merry and gay." Gay means happy. The 6th of March, Independence Day. This is an African in Trinidad writing a song that celebrates the independence of Ghana. Why? Because the Black world, was in a revolutionary era and was connecting up. Okay, I'm gonna skip sorry, let me actually do this. So then Sekou Touré, head of state of Guinea, Guinea becomes independent as well. And remember I said that Kwame Touré Stokely Carmichael reclaims the name Kwame Touré. Why? Because he's inspired by the legacy of these two great men, Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré, heads of states of revolutionary Ghana and Guinea respectively. And so then now let's deal with Modibo Keïta, the man below Kwame Nkrumah, who was the head of state of revolutionary Mali. And these three heads of states actually formed what is called the Ghana-Guinea-Mali Union. This was now these three African independent states now who had thrown off the shackles, of British and French colonization respectively, forming a union in order to protect Africa, from what Kwame Nkrumah would later define as neocolonialism, which is basically the colonizers, European colonizers, trying to maintain their foothold in terms of the oppression of African states. All right, but they were trying to unify. So Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré and Modibo Keïta were trying to get rid of the arbitrary borders that were created by these Europeans, because these nation states were actually created by Europeans, the European colonizers. Stay tuned, we're going to go into that a little bit further later on. Alright, then now I'm going to go to the man called Dedan Kimati. Dedan Kimati is important because he was one of the leaders of a group popularly known as the Mau Mau. Mau Mau, more properly referred to as the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, were the people who waged an armed rebellion, revolution war in Kenya. The Mau Mau primarily members of the Kikuyu nation in Kenya, and basically they in the 1950s were just not having it, picked up arms and started to basically remove European colonizers, specifically the British, from their land. And so many actually speak to the fact that, I know Malcolm X is one, if you listen to speeches in the last 2 years of Malcolm X's life, he speaks about the Mau Mau, and his statements, he said, it took the Mau Mau, to bring liberation not just to Kenya, but to half of Africa, because the European colonizers were afraid that the example that was of the Mau Mau, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, would be picked up, by many other groups, in different nations in Africa. So they actually came to the negotiating table and granted independence, to many nations in order to withstand or avoid possibility of more armed rebellions in other African nations. And so we big up Dedan Kimati because he was not a head of state, but he was one of the primary leaders of an armed rebellion. Next to him, you have Patrice Lumumba. Yes, Patrice Lumumba, Prime Minister of Revolutionary Congo, who was assassinated within just 6 months, of him coming to power in that nation. He actually signed a secret agreement, with Kwame Nkrumah to join the Union of African States that was already constructed under the Ghana-Guinea-Mali Union. And Congo is particularly important because Congo is the richest country on the planet Earth. Yes. It is said that Congo has the potential in terms of natural resources to provide power to the entire African continent. And so strategically, that would have been a power move, and it was important for the colonizers, the former colonizers of the time, to really maintain their stronghold in the Congo. And so that's why Patrice Lumumba was assassinated so quickly, because he basically was charting an African self-determined road towards self-determination and liberation. Below Secretary, there's Josina Machel, who she's put there, but she's the first wife of Samora Machel, but she was instrumental in leading the rebellion, the revolution in Mozambique. Yes, and that's why she's there as a member of Frelimo in Mozambique. Next to her, you have Nomzamo Madikizela Mandela, more popularly known as Winnie Mandela, who, as we know, was instrumental in South Africa. These are two powerful African women, who were instrumental, in the liberation of both their nations, and not specific to just their nations, but the entire African continent. And next to them, we have the man by the name of Amilcar Cabral, powerful revolutionary leader in Guinea-Bissau. Yes, Guinea-Bissau. But the point is that all of the energy that was revolving around the African continent was inspiring the African world in general. So whereas we look at the Black Power era, in reality, the axis, the central focal point of this revolutionary era in the Black world at this time was actually the African continent. Was actually the African continent. Malcolm X, met many of these men, that are mentioned here and more. He traveled to Africa and spent the majority of the last year of his life actually on the African continent. He was on personal speaking terms with people like Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré and others, And Patrice Lumumba, who he never met, but he was actually his favourite of all of these leaders. And many others. John Henrik Clarke travelled to the continent, specifically Ghana, during this time. And as I already mentioned, Kwame Touré travelled, and Martin Luther King travelled to Africa during this period also. So you can see that these people were linking up. So that the sense of identity and how it affected the movement in the United States of America led students, in various universities to push for Black studies. And it was actually students, who were fighting student-led activism, in America that actually shifted the focus from Negro History Week to Black History Month, which I think was first founded in 1970. I think it was first celebrated in 1970 as a result of all this Black Power energy. All right, so we're going to go from the United States of America to the Caribbean, and who we see here on the left-hand side is a man by the name of Walter Rodney, an activist from Guyana. Who was prolific around the Caribbean and actually taught at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, but this revolutionary era, 60s and 70s that we're dealing with, was affecting the Caribbean as well. Walter Rodney, the author of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and a number of other titles, a prolific academic and activist, opposite him, you have the man by the name of Maurice Bishop, who led a successful revolution in the island of Grenada in 1979. Powerful man, and the movement that he was a co-leader of, the new movement for the revolutionary government in Grenada. Extremely important. And Haile Selassie was not featured on the previous slide. That is because he's here. I will place him in this particular context because it was his Imperial Majesty that became the primary inspiration behind the development of the Rastafari movement in Jamaica and the Caribbean in general. Okay, what you see here in the middle at the top is a group of Rastafari sisters and brethren, specifically Count Ozzy and the Mystic Revelation of Rastafari, which was a band, yes. And below that, you see His Imperial Majesty in Jamaica in the year 1966, shaking the hand of Prince Emmanuel, yeah, Edwards of the Bobo Shanti, yes, the Bobo Shanti Rastafari mansion, okay. And the point is that all of this energy, yeah, was proliferating around the black world. The Africans were revolutionizing politically, spiritually, and culturally. And therefore, Africans in the Caribbean were now pushing this African identity, this African-centered specific identity. We're doing away now with the terms like Negro and Coloured. And we're asserting ourselves as not just black, but African. And connecting with Africa, okay? All of this, yeah, and whenever there's a strong movement, cultural, political, economic movement of black people, there is a strong arts movement of African people. And you see various artists depicted here. We're just going through some historical points. We're not dwelling on any of these things, okay? We're just touching on them, all right? So what we see here, at the top from left to right, you see the last poets, yeah, the godfathers of hip-hop, poetry, spoken word activity of the Black Power era. Next to them, it is Gil Scott Heron, another one of those prolific poets of that era. Next to him, you have a very young picture of the Wailers, yes, the Wailers, Bob Marley, Bonnie Wheeler, and Peter Tosh. Reggae music became the primary promotional propaganda vehicle for the Rastafari movement, and many people learnt much from reggae music. Next to them, you have E.T. Mensah, yeah, one of the fathers of high life, yeah. E.T. Mensah wrote one of the theme tunes for Ghana independence, and also the song a song about the Ghana-Guinea-Mali Union. Yes, high life was the primary music of West Africa in the liberation or independence era of that time, and E.T. Mensah was among the foremost musicians of that era. Left to right at the bottom now, you have one of the greatest artists ever to grace human creation, and that is a man by the name of Fela Anikulapo Kuti, known as the Black President, and what brought black revolutionary politics, economics, spirituality, and culture through his music. Next to him, you have Miss Louise Bennett Coverley, yes, the mother of Jamaican culture, who was recently honored by the unveiling of a statue in her honor in what was formerly Gordon Square, which is now Miss Lou Garden or Square in Jamaica. She basically, in Jamaica, you have this idea of the superiority of European culture, and as a part of that, the language of the Jamaican people, which is popularly known as patois, yes, what is basically seen as very you know, rudimentary, savage, degrading, yeah. And at the time, you know, even when I was growing up, people would tell you to talk properly, yeah. People didn't respect the Jamaican language, yeah. And Miss Lou was the foremost individual responsible for projecting pride in Jamaican culture and connecting Jamaican culture with its African roots. So she was the one who taught us, yeah, that Jamaican patois actually has an African origin in terms of its form, many of the words that we use and them kind of things there, and getting us to see pride in the Africanness, okay? So Miss Louise Bennett was prominent at that time. Next to her, you have Abby Lincoln and Max Roach. They were a married couple around this time also, and these are jazz musicians, a jazz drummer, Max Roach, and a jazz vocalist, Abby Lincoln, who were prominent in creating Black Power music, yeah, around that time, all right? Next to them, you have the amazing, yeah, Mama Miriam Makeba, who was exiled from South Africa during this time because of the apartheid that was being suffered by Africans in South Africa. But as a result, she became one of the primary activists in the world, spreading the word about what Africans were suffering in South Africa at that time. She eventually actually married the man who I mentioned earlier, Kwame Ture. And when he was on the run from the American state, because the American FBI and the CIA were after him, yeah, they actually moved to Guinea and were living under the government of Sekou Touré and Kwame Nkrumah over there in Guinea. And from that base, they became the world's #1 Pan-Africanist musician and activist international couple. They were actually ambassadors of Guinea and the Pan-African Revolution at that time. Okay, so Mama Miriam Makeba, not enough can be said about this woman, you know what I mean? Fantastic, beautiful, accomplished musician and also activist. And next to her, you have the great John Coltrane, who blew away all the pain, yeah? John Coltrane, the founder of what is known as spiritual jazz, I should say the key proponent of what is called spiritual jazz, whereby Africans now are studying, yeah, African spiritual retentions in America, in the Americas, I should say, yeah. So throughout South and Central America, because John Coltrane studied these musics and looking at the African rhythmic retentions, yes, in the spiritual music of the time, studying African music of the time, and you will see now more specific, more explicit, I should say, African rhythms here coming through the jazz, yeah? And so this is what was going on in that time. I'm going to come back to Max Roach, because Max Roach is actually famous for jumping on stage during a Miles Davis performance with a placard that said, "Africa for the Africans at home and abroad." And if you recognize that statement, you will know that that is the statement of a man by the name of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Marcus Mosiah Garvey, yes indeed, kings and queens, who is the foundation of all of this. And we can judge that by quotes from people like Kwame Nkrumah, who said that it was Marcus Garvey, the philosophy of opinions of Garvey, was the book that most inspired or fired his enthusiasm for African liberation and African independence. So around this time, many people were drawing inspiration and studying and looking at the legacy of Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the UNIACL to draw inspiration theoretically and organizationally for the work that they were engaged in. Okay, all right, so that's that. Now, yeah, we're gonna go into how Black History Month gets to the UK. Alright, so to begin with, yeah, we're going to start by looking at what was happening in the UK during this same era, this Black Power era, this revolutionary era, because many people don't know that during the 1960s, there was actually a Black Power era in the UK, and that was led by a man by the name of Obi Egbuna, a man born and raised in Nigeria, moves to the UK, and is the father of Black Power in the UK, kings and queens. He's a playwright and author, among many other things. I want to shout out to Obi Egbuna Jr. also, who is a man who's most definitely walking in his father's footsteps. Okay, we have next to Obi Egbuna, Claudia Jones, yes, a woman from Trinidad, yes, who moved to the UK in the 1950s and is, as much as they would like to deny it, the mother of Carnival, kings and queens. Carnival, the first quote-unquote West Indian or Caribbean carnival in 1959, was a response to the Notting Hill riots of 1958, during which white men were running through Notting Hill, the houses that African men, women and children had saved their hard-earned money and bought, and vandalizing their homes and aggressing their physical being. And what happened was the African men of the time began to defend themselves and their families and were arrested and charged with possession of an offensive weapon, among other things. And so Claudia Jones, under the theme of a people's art is the genesis of their freedom, hosted the first carnival in this country, yes, and part of what she was doing was raising money to pay for the legal fees, the legal defense fees of these African men who were arrested for defending themselves and their families. Okay, so we have to know about the movements that were going on here, right here in the UK. All right. And next to her, you have Audley Evans, Paul Stevenson, and Owen Henry, who were the leaders of the Bristol bus boycott, which took place in the 1960s, yeah? The 1960s, specifically 1963, at the same time as the March on Washington was taking place, yes, in the 1960s, there was actually the Bristol bus boycott that was actually inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott in the United States of America in the 1950s. These men were fighting against what was called the color bar, yes, in terms of trying to seek employment and fair pay on buses in Bristol, and waged a boycott of the bus system, and basically got black men employed, yeah, with fair wages during the 1960s. Okay, so this is just a brief snapshot of the history of activism that black people have over here in the UK. Okay, all right. So jumping forward about 20 years, again, many times we celebrate Black History Month every year, and the name Achiaba Adayesebo is never mentioned, okay? But he is actually the founder of Black History Month in the UK. Achiaba Adayesebo is actually born and raised in Nkrumah's Ghana, okay? So Kwame Nkrumah is one of his biggest inspirations, and he came to England in the year 1984, all right? He had spent some time in America also, teaching there, and that's where he learned about Black History Month. He comes to England in the year 1984. What's happening in England in the year 1984 is that Africans in England are going through what my father refers to as the turbulent 80s. Just a few key events that give explanation to the term turbulent 80s. First of all, we start with the New Cross Massacre in January 1981. A firebomb attack, a racist firebomb attack against a party full of African men, women and children who were assailed with this firebomb, killing 13 young black men, women and children. The cry was 13 dead and nothing said, and with all the injustices that were being faced by African people, black people in this country at the time, they organized across the country, yeah, to put on what is called the Black People's Day of Action, which is in March, the 2nd of March, 1981. 25,000 black men, women and children came out onto the streets to protest the injustice of the New Cross Massacre, the fact that the police were botching the investigation, trying to charge the people in the party of being responsible for the fire, refusing to investigate the thing properly, and also the general injustices that we were being faced because police brutality and racist attack was an everyday reality for African people on the streets of Britain. Which also culminated in the Brixton riots in April of 1981 and mass uprisings all over the country. Yeah, every city with a significant black population had an uprising in 1981. From Birmingham, Handsworth Revolution, big up Still Post, Manchester, Bristol, Toxteth, Liverpool, yeah, High Wycombe, Nottingham, yeah, any city with a significant black population had an uprising in 1981. And then moving forward, you have the final major uprising of that period, which was the Broadwater Farm uprising in 1985, okay? But in this era, yeah, it's not just uprisings and so-called riots as they call them, but black organizations, many Pan-Africanist organizations such as the Pan-African Congress movement had developed during that time. The Black Unity and Freedom Party had developed during that time. You know what I'm saying? My organization, the Al-Qaeda Revivalist Movement, had developed during that time. There was a Black Panther Party in the UK that developed during that time, you know what I'm saying? Shout out to people like Olive Morris, yeah, who were involved in that particular energy right there. And so many African organizations, black organizations were developing during this time. And so as a result, there was a thing called the Scarman Report, which was looking into the unrest, yeah, of black people in Britain at that time and why the hell these Negroes were rioting, okay? And one of the things that he suggested is that Britain has to create a black middle class, okay? And so the British society were looking now to bring certain black people within its, remit, yeah, to be able to give the impression of progress, inclusion within British society, and various different institutions and organisations were set up during that particular period of time. It also led to the first black MPs, namely Bernie Grant, namely Diane Abbott, and namely Paul Boateng, being elected to Parliament as Labour candidates in 1986. Okay, but in all of this energy, yeah, this activism energy culminated in 1987 and 1988 in what is called African Jubilee Year. All right, and this African Jubilee Year was designed to commemorate, celebrate three major anniversaries that were during that time. Okay, one was the centenary of the birth of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Yes, understanding once again the impact that he had, yeah, on black organization and activism throughout the 20th century. The 25th anniversary since the founding of the OAU. Yes, the OAU. The Organization of African Unity, which I neglected to mention earlier, was the organization that was founded by His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I and Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah to unify African nations towards, you know, developing diplomatic relationships so that they could basically forward, yeah, a unified development project in the independence era. Okay, and there's more politics and, you know what I mean, nuances involved in that, but that's the basics of the situation. This is actually before Europe had a European Union, in fact. Okay, all right. So African Jubilee Year, yeah, 25th anniversary of the OAU, which was founded in 1963, and then the 150th anniversary of emancipation. Basically, this is the ending of a formal ending of slavery in the Caribbean in the 1930s. Okay, so these three major anniversaries were coming up between 1987 and 1988, and so therefore, in that spirit, yeah, Africans, various different groups came together and designated the African Jubilee Year and put on various programs, yeah, throughout that year. One of them was the inauguration of Black History Month in the UK, yes, as founded by Achiaba Adaye Sebo, so, and others who I'm going to mention later. But what was the inspiration behind Achiaba Adaye Sebo suggesting and putting forward Black History Month in the UK? In his own words, and this is a interview taken from an interview that he done with a brother called Kubira Zemani from Nubiat, yes, and he explaining the inspiration behind Black History Month. So the inspiration for Black History Month came from an incident that happened at the GLC where I worked as the coordinator of special projects. A colleague of mine, a woman, came to work one morning looking very downcast and not herself. I asked her what was the matter, and she confided to me that the previous night when she was putting her son Marcus to bed, he asked her, "Mum, why can't I be white?" Okay, and so he goes on in the interview to explain that he had, while I was in America, made a point of teaching black children about their history, about their culture, about the history of Africa and African people, about his history as an Ashanti and the customs of the Ashanti, the names of the Ashanti, the food of the Ashanti, the music, the drumming of the Ashanti. And he saw the impact that had on the students that he was teaching, the African that he was teaching in America, yeah, and he learned about Black History Month in America also. So he thought, well, why not bring Black History Month to the UK? He goes on to explain. So when this incident with Marcus took place, it dawned on me that something had to be done here in Britain. I was familiar, very familiar with Black History Month in America and thought that something like that had to be done here in the UK. Because if this was the fountainhead of colonialism, imperialism and racism, as that, well, basically what he's saying is that the British Empire, which was governing at the time of the British Empire, 1/3 of the planet was under British rule. Yeah, so this is the fountainhead, yeah, like nobody don't know how to colonize places more than Britain, all right, of colonialism, imperialism and racism. And despite all the institutions of higher learning and research and also the cluster of African embassies, you could still find a 6-year-old boy being confused about his identity even though his mother had tried to correct it at birth. Two things there. One, he's come to the same conclusion that Carter G. Woodson came to when he says, despite all institutions of higher learning and research and the cluster of African embassies, the Negro, thus educated, is a hopeless liability. Why? Because he has no knowledge of himself. His education doesn't equip him with a knowledge of himself. Therefore, he lacks racial self-esteem and collective memory. Okay? The second thing is, even though his mother had tried to correct it at birth, yeah, his mother, the mother of this 6-year-old boy, Marcus, had tried to instill some pride and dignity in him, partly by naming him after Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Yes? And so he's saying, in spite of all of this young man grew up wanting to be white. So he instituted Black History Month in the United Kingdom, yeah, in order to reverse that process. Once again, the purpose of Black History Month is to give black people, yes, and all people, but black people in particular, a proper understanding and appreciation of their history, so we know who and what we are and where we are. We know the purpose that it's designed to serve. Okay. All right. Going forward, the aims and objectives of African Jubilee Year, Black History Month respectively, were to promote positive public images and understanding of Africans and African people, Africans and people of African descent, and encourage the positive teaching and development of their history, culture, and struggles. 2, to support African organizations and liberation movements based in London. Once again, this is not just a vain exercise in studying and learning and teaching about black history, prominent black figures in history, African empires, kings and queens. It was about feeding in, yeah, to existing movements of activism at that time. Yeah, and we're going to get an idea of that in a second, where we talk about the African Jubilee Declaration. The African Jubilee Declaration is therefore a testament of London's solidarity with Africa and the international struggles against apartheid. Apartheid at that time was probably the most prominent, movement, global movement of African people fighting against an oppressive system during the 1980s. By the designation of October as Black History Month, it is our expectation that Africa's ideals shall forever be manifested in the upliftment of the African personality in our schools, institutions of higher learning, communities, borough councils, and especially in the hearts, minds, and deeds of politicians. Yeah, they wanted the politicians, especially because Africans were being elected during that time, to be imbibed and imbued, with this spirit of African pride and the African personality, so that they would enact policies that were to the favor rather than to the detriment of African people, black people in this country. Here we have Herman Ousley, Linda Bellos, and MP Bernie Grant, who were also instrumental into the development of African Jubilee Year and Black History Month specifically. Okay, all of these individuals and more were involved in the inaugural Black History Month in 1987. In fact, I read something recently where Linda Bellos was saying that if she knew what she knows now then, she'd have probably called it African History Month as opposed to Black History Month. But one of the things that Bernie Grant in particular is responsible for doing, in the 1990s, there was a thing called the Abuja Conference in Nigeria, and that conference was about reparations. Bernie Grant attended that conference and came back, and what he did was he raised, under the government of Margaret Thatcher, and John Major, all this activity was taking place, and he raised the issue of reparations. He was the first African to raise the issue of reparations for the enslavement of African people in the parliament at that time. Yes, so we have many disagreements with Bernie Grant politically, but we respect Bernie Grant for that particular effort right there, and that is a key moment in the development of African or black activism in this country. This is just an image of one of the events, the Black History events or African Jubilee Year events right there. Okay, and you can see Marcus Garvey in the backdrop there, and this flyer is actually the flyer for the first event, all right, that took place. Yes. And the first person that was actually invited was actually Maulana Karenga, who I mentioned earlier. What I didn't mention was that him and the US organization were actually the people that founded the celebration of Kwanzaa. And that is one of the reasons why he was invited to the UK. He's a prolific academic, author of a book by the name of Introduction to Black Studies, among many others. But yes, his organization founded the organization of Kwanzaa, the African or the Pan-African Cultural Celebration. And so he was invited under the auspices of the London Strategic Policy Committee, the Association of London Authorities and Inner London Educational Authority invite. So this is now black people being given funding, yeah, from these authorities to set up organizations and put on programs for black people. Yeah, look at the list here of people who came. This is just a glimpse here. This is not the whole, it's not an exhaustive list, but this is who, yeah, the people, Achaba Adaya Sebo, Linda Bellos, Herman Ousley, Bernie Grant and others, yeah, were given funding, yeah, to bring over during that time. Okay, John Henrik Clark, Grand Master Teacher Historian. Yusuf Ben Yokanan, Grand Master Teacher Historian. Sally Mugabe, yes, the first wife of Robert Mugabe. Why? Because Zimbabwe had gotten its independence in the year 1980. Yes, the year 1980. And at the time, I've actually still got that T-shirt. Yeah, if I can find a T-shirt, I'm gonna put the T-shirt in the presentation. Yeah, but there's a T-shirt entitled that had the words in it: Zimbabwe today, South Africa tomorrow. Yeah, so celebrating the independence of Zimbabwe because it was brought about via an armed rebellion, but then saying, all right, now we're looking towards South Africa. The same thing happened in Zimbabwe. We want it to happen in South Africa now. We're fighting for that to happen in South Africa, yeah? So Sally Mugabe and Robert Mugabe at that time were considered a major inspiration. Sally Mugabe came over in that spirit. And Nina Simone, who I've already mentioned, need I say any more? Graça, or Grace Machel, who was the wife, the second wife of Samora Machel now, yes? Of Mozambique. Again, Mozambique having fought and gotten its independence was also an inspiration. Francis Cress Wilson, yeah? #1 black psychiatrist of that era who wrote the book, The ISIS Papers, okay? And was revolutionizing our understanding of white supremacy and racism and also the education of black children at the time, yes? Max Roach, I mentioned earlier. In fact, there's a park in Brixton, yeah, named after Max Roach. Max Roach Park in Brixton is actually named after this great jazz drummer. Yes, Burning Spear, Rastafari again, yeah, who was the #1 man of the era teaching about Marcus Garvey. No one remembers old Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey words come to pass. Yeah, Burning Spear, me say. All right, Tony Martin, the #1 historian in the world on the life and legacy of the most eminent prophet, Marcus Messiah Garvey, and the great Hugh Masekela. Imagine just in the year between 1987 and 1988, all of these and more. I saw something recently that said Thomas Sankara was involved. I haven't confirmed whether he actually came into the country. That's why he's not pictured here, yeah? All these people came for the celebrations and the observances. But Thomas Sankara was in some way, shape or form involved. Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, yes, who made Burkina Faso between the years of 1983 and 1987 when he was assassinated, made Burkina Faso food self-sufficient in the space of 4 years. Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah. So all of this, yeah, was defining our identity as black and African people of that era. Yes. You can see, based upon the people that were brought in from abroad, the organizations that were developing over here and the programs that were put on during African Jubilee year, African people in this country were definitely identifying as black and African. Black and African, and defining what that meant and putting on programs that spoke to that definition, yeah, and affirming that definition, and that definition was inspiring the activism and what people were looking for in that era, okay? So for the rest of the presentation, what we're going to be doing is looking at the proper percentages of history Yes, and we're going to be here for approximately 20 minutes to half an hour more. So stick with me, you know what I mean, if you can. I hope you're getting something from it so far. All right, but we're going to be looking at the issue of identity first and foremost. And then I'm going to look at the examples of people that are doing things that are making history in our a Black or African UK present day reality. And then I'm going to look from an international perspective as somebody who is definitely doing some fantastic work into reversing the impacts of colonialism in African nations. Okay, so bear with me, and we're going to wrap up in a very appropriate manner in this presentation entitled Black History Month is Dead. What we're trying to do here is reaffirm the substance of what Black History Month is supposed to mean to us as a people. Okay, all right, so identity, definition once again, to the fact of being who or what a person is, the characteristics determining who or what a person is, and a close similarity or affinity. This definition is here based upon the history that I've just explained. Africans in the 1980s was definitely, looking towards the characteristics of being an African in terms of looking towards Africa, or predominantly Black nations that were preserving the history and the culture of Africa for defining who and what we are. Yes, we were developing a close similarity and affinity with the Black world. So Africans in the Caribbean are linking up with Africans on the continent. Africans on the continent are linking up with Africans in America. Africans in America are linking up with Africans in the UK. And all of that is taking place, kings and queens. And all of that is revolving once again around the axis of the continent of Africa and what it means to be an African. In all our varied expressions of what it means to be an African, we were expressing what it means and defining what it means and affirming what it means to be an African. Okay, and so us over here now, as we are in many places, we developed this tug of war between the African or the Black identity and what that means in the context of a British identity. Yes, and I'm putting forward the fact that in Britain, in the UK, predominantly Black people are defined under certain designations. Okay, the cultural ones are Black, African Caribbean, yes. And then nowadays you have Black Caribbean or Black African. Okay, all right. But outside of that, the political definitions under which we are designated is ethnic minority, Black minority ethnic, or BME, underprivileged. Yes, we are overrepresented in the poor and underprivileged, working class and urban. And urban is a cultural terminology that is used to basically replace the word Black, so that we don't have to identify that the music comes from Black origin, or African origin. We can say it's urban. Therefore, anybody from any heritage can claim it as long as they were born and raised around Black people. Yeah, that's what that's there for. Okay, but the important things about these definitions is that ethnic minority, Black minority, ethnic, working class, underprivileged, and the kind of things there are not just phrases and terms. These terms speak to power relationships. Yeah, so if there's an ethnic minority, there's an ethnic majority. Yes, if there's an underprivileged, there is a privileged or an overprivileged, and so there's a power relationship. These designations relate to your political, social, and economic mobility in the society in which you live. Okay. All right. Now, recently, there has been a question as to whether more Black people than ever are identifying as British or English. During the era that I've just spoken about, the 1970s and 80s, many of us, in the 1980s, born in the 1980s, and I can say that, like, at the time, most of us, would not call ourselves English, okay? And if we called ourselves British, it was a matter of the passport. If you ask a Black person where they come from, they will tell you, the origin, even if they were born here, they will tell you the origin, the place of birth of their parents. If you're from Jamaica, you say Jamaica. Or you may say you're a West Indian. If you're from Trinidad, you say Trinidad. If you're from Ghana, you say Ghana, Nigerian. You just say African or Caribbean. Yes, or West Indian. Okay? But I'm born here. You know what I mean? Like, I'm from Jamaica or Antigua, like I would say. But man's born here, innit? But I'm an African. That's how I would define it. Alright? But because we're like third generation over here now, many of us are asking the question, are we more like the youth them? Are the youth them just English now? Various statistics have come out And you know, I haven't put the statistics in the presentation because you can't get I haven't sorted through a definitive one or two yet. You know what I'm saying? I have seen, however, that upwards of 70% of young black men and women are identifying as British and or English. Okay, but the event that took place recently that had most people questioning this was the World Cup. Yeah, during which over half the England squad, yeah, were people of African Caribbean heritage, yes, and so there was record numbers of support for the England team, yeah. Enough times, yeah, there's a phrase, anybody but England. I think the Scottish are responsible for coining the phrase, but it was not uncommon among the black community UK to want England to lose, especially in football and cricket, yes. Never supported England, even if you rated and supported the black players who played for England. Supporting the England team was a no-no. Yes? Wearing Union Jack was a no-no. Wearing St. George's flag was a no-no. But that seemed to have changed, yeah, in recent times, because more of the England football team is man them. Yeah, man them who man can relate to, alright? So, David Olusoga, UK television personality and historian and academic, has written this article in The Guardian entitled, Gareth Southgate's England team reflects the best of us. It feels good to embrace them, okay? For black and Asian people, he says, of my generation, the England team and the cross of St. George were once ingredients in a toxic broth. For decades, a minority of England fans brought the nation and the national team into disrepute, bringing violence both to foreign streets and immigrant communities at home. The banner that fluttered above many of these ugly scenes was the flag of George, yeah, and also the Union Jack, which was the symbol of the NF at that time. Such violence, he continues, and abuse have not completely gone away, but in recent years, those memories and associations have increasingly seemed out of step with contemporary reality. Gareth Southgate's team, with an average age of 26, have no memories of those earlier decades. They are England's most diverse World Cup team. 11 of the 23-man squad are black or mixed race, and that diversity runs deeper beyond so-called visible minorities. Harry Kane, for example, is of Irish descent. Alright, he continues, in this glorious summer, we find ourselves with a young, diverse, dynamic team who evidently like one another and are led by an inspirational manager. He, in turn, is supported by a backroom staff made up of intelligent and inspirational professionals, such as the psychologist Dr. Pippa Grange, the woman being credited with helping England win their first penalty shootout in a World Cup. A new professionalism and a new culture has been forged under St. George's flag that flutters over England's training camp, St. George's Park, near Derby. Okay? Now, this is very interesting to me. Okay? The main thing I want to pull out of this, yeah, is this idea that our parents' generation saw the England flag and the England team and the Union Jack as symbols of racial violence, attack, and aggression. Okay? The younger generation, as he says, has no memory of that. Yeah? My question is that a good thing? Yeah? That the children of people for whom the Union Jack and St. George's flag were symbols of racial aggression have no memory. Again, we've lost the collective memory. And the loss of that, is it the loss of that collective memory that allows us to more identify with what it means to be British and English? And if that is the case, that the identification of British and English, yeah, is at the expense of a collective memory, is that something for us to celebrate? Yeah? It's an important question that we have to ask as black people in the UK. Okay? And if that is the case, what does black history mean, yes, in the context of that kind of loss of collective memory? What does Black history mean if our identity is defined more by our Englishness, perceived, and Britishness than our Blackness and our Africanness collectively? What does it mean? Yeah, questions that we have to ask. Yeah, I'm putting forward that one of the implications of this is that Black history is going to be defined more by contributions to British society rather than, self-determined Black pride and dignity that stands alone. Okay, so for example, you're going to get more of an emphasis, on Black people in ancient Greece and Rome, for example, Black people in the British monarchy, Black veterans of the British Army in World War I and World War II, for example. These are just examples, and all of these things are going to be celebrated as contributions to British society, but these things can be dangerous because if we're looking at Black contributions to the British Army, for example, in World War I and World War II, can we properly look at that outside of the context of the British colonization of African and Caribbean nations, which is the context in which Black people came to be fighting for Britain in the first place? So I am not saying that we should not look at and study the history of Black World War I and II veterans, in terms of our contribution to the British Army, but we should also look at the context in which those contributions were made, and the implications, of us being involved in those wars also, and what does that say, in terms of our identity, in this country, you know what I mean? Just throwing it out there, you know what I'm saying? Things that we have to look at, Finally, all of this insurrection around our heightened representation in the England team, we also have to ask, does that high representation change the power dynamic that I mentioned earlier? So are we any less underprivileged? Black and ethnic minority, working class, Does it change the dynamic between the underprivileged, the privileged, and the overprivileged, that we have now more representation in the England team and therefore can see ourselves more as English and British? We have to ask these questions if we're going to be true to the spirit, of what Black History Month, and the people that were founding that time were trying to achieve. Okay, all right. Finally, we're going to go into some present-day examples of people who are doing some brilliant things to create history in our present-day circumstance. I'm going to start with a brother by the name of Kehinde Andrews, and his organization called the Organization of Black Unity. Okay, the Organization of Black Unity are trying to establish or reopen the Marcus Garvey Nursery, which is one of the first independent nurseries run by Black people in this country, and they're trying to reopen it. And as you can see in this image, the building that is behind them is a 3-story building which they are in control of and manage, and they were at this point trying to renovate the building, to reopen it as the Marcus Garvey Nursery. Just Google Organization of Black Unity and you will find that work there. This example is here because it also speaks to history as well as contemporary example of Black people doing brilliant things on behalf of Black people. Secondly, this is a sister by the name of Akua Gyamfi. She is the founder and managing director of the British Blacklist. .co.uk. The idea behind the British Blacklist.co.uk was simple. There we often talk about the fact that there are not enough, Black people on television, behind the screen, as writers, producers of television shows. Black literature in the UK is not celebrated as much as it should be, and so on and so forth. So Akua Gyamfi thought, well, where would you go to find a directory of Black actors, actresses, writers, producers, and so on and so forth, right? All these things, Where would you go to find that directory? The one doesn't exist, so let me create a directory. And also, let me create a magazine along with that directory, a magazine site that will address the issues, the social, political, artistic, and economic issues pertaining to these Africans or Black people in these various disciplines in the industry. And so the British Blacklist.co.uk is one such institution, and it's here because the woman is doing fantastic work, fantastic, brilliant work. So check out the British Blacklist.co.uk. We also have Hardwired, or should I say All Nights Comics, All Nights Comics, allnightscomics.com, as you can see there, who are the preeminent Black comic book publishing company, in the UK. Fantastic storylines that are centered around Black heroes, with African-centered narratives, Black-centered narratives, that, futuristic narrative that relate not just to our history and culture, but Black utopian and dystopian futures, kings and queens, you know what I mean? So do check out All Night's comics, you know what I'm saying? Positive black imagery for black men, women and children, alright? And then we have the Best Kept Secret Spoken Word Collective, of which I am a member. The Best Kept Secret Spoken Word Collective specialise in spoken word theatre, kings and queens, you know what I mean? And so in 2005 and 2009, we staged this production called Tugstar for President. One of our members called Tugstar wrote 2 pieces in which he was putting forward a manifesto of a pro-black presidential candidate with a pro-black agenda. And so we developed a whole theatrical piece around that, using art to develop you know, to put forward actual productive solutions here to the issues that we face as a black community. And finally, I am also a member of the Got Kush TV team, yeah, the #1 platform in the UK promoting conscious black music and group economics. Search that under YouTube and subscribe to the channel Got Kush TV, and I'll see you over there. Alright, and the final element that we're going to get to now is how we use our understanding of African history to solve some of the problems of today. Alright, so one of the key aspects here, one of the key topics of conversation in the UK today is Brexit, the exit of Britain from the European Union. And during the debates, yeah, whether we were going to leave or remain or whatever, one of the primary things that was being said, particularly by those who wanted to remain, was that the European Union has presided over the longest period of peace in European history. Okay, prior to the founding of the European Union, was constantly at war, which is very interesting given the image, the depiction that they give us of Africa always having been in perpetual tribal wars, yeah, from since the creation of time till now. Okay, but the longest period of history in Europe, of peace in European history, is the last 70 years, by their own admission. Okay, and so what that says to me is that in the debate now, they're looking at the worth of the European Union in this context and remain in it because of that, and so on and so forth. The point is that these people are still trying to solve the problems of World War II. Okay, World War II, 1940s, under which black nations, majority black nations, were, for the most part, colonized. Yeah? So I thought, let me use an example, yes, that relates to that same period of history, looking at a problem that needs to be solved today, based upon that history. I have an example of a group of people that are actually doing fantastic work in solving that problem. Alright? Just so you can follow my train of logic. Yeah? Okay. So, what was the condition of black people during that time? Is the question that we have to first ask ourselves. What problems did that throw up, and how can we solve them? So, we're going to first go to Ababa Chinwezu. Yes? In his book, Decolonizing the African Mind, he gives us a good explanation of what the true value of history is, yes? And I'm introducing this term now into the discourse, history as cultural therapy. He says the possibility of history providing cultural therapy for development has been remarked upon by Joseph Kizerbo, an African historian from Burkina Faso. He says history can play the same role as the psychoanalyst as long as we don't know how to explain certain events, certain behavior which exists today in the individual and collective planes. We will remain prisoners of our past because we don't understand it. If one doesn't understand his history, even his own personal or private history, he can cultivate complexes, believing, for example, that one is damned. History allows us to understand who we are. If one doesn't know who one is, one can't know what one wants to become. I think that the almost exclusive role of history is to lay down this fundamental base for development. Baba Chinwezu continues, following the line of thought expressed above, I have come to believe that our past, by the tasks it implicitly sets us, is our compass to our future. We're back on this same symbology of the compass and the map, yeah, of human history. All right? History, by the task it implicitly sets us, is a compass to our future. That a map of our past is the pathfinder to our destiny. Thus, if we misread the map or consult an incorrect map, we will misdirect our efforts in changing our future. So therefore, what he's saying is that Africans can't chart our own development, yeah, according to the development of Europe, especially because Europe are our historical oppressors and colonizers, yeah. We're going to pray on the wisdom of Mama Marimba Annie, who develops this concept called Ma'at Ma'afa Sankofa. Yes, Ma'at being Africans in Africa pre-colonization, slavery, yeah, and oppression. Okay, Ma'at is an ancient Kemetic principle which speaks to truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, reciprocity, and order. This is us in our original state, right? Europeans enter and put us through the condition of Ma'afa. Ma'afa is the invasion, colonization, enslavement, conquest of Africa and African people. Okay, this puts us in a state of Isfet. Isfet is the opposite of Ma'at. If Ma'at is truth, Isfet is lie. If Ma'at is order, Isfet is disorder. If Ma'at is freedom, Isfet is oppression. In order to come out of the state of Isfet, we have to go through the process of Sankofa. Sankofa is a Akan word, which means go back and fetch it, return and fetch it, yes? Is symbolized by the bird who has its head turning backwards as its feet face forward, meaning that you must look back before you go forward. You must have a proper understanding of history before you go forward, all right? So, with that backdrop, we're going to go on to what we call the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference in 1884-1885 was the conference during which African as a continent was cut up into various nation states for the benefit of facilitating European economic domination of the continent itself. This is basically slavery moving from a private to a national enterprise. They stopped kidnapping Africans from the continent and now came to the continent themselves and commandeered land via a series of bloody massacre invasions throughout the 1800s, culminating in the Berlin Conference in 1985, which Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Germany, with the benefit of America, sat around a table and carved up Africa like a pie. So you can see in this particular image in 1880, yes, 1880, this is how the African continent looked. The various parts in colour depict the various places in which, by 1880, Europeans had already had a stronghold on the continent. But you can see the significant areas in grey where Europeans had not really solidified their influence as yet, even though many of these areas had been affected by Arab and European invasion for over 1,000 years. But by 1913, you can see, the various borders had been developed and were under the areas that were under British, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, German, Belgium rule. Okay, by that time. All right, so you can see that. All right. Now, what did colonization represent or mean on the educational front? We're going to explore one of the impacts of colonization on Africa and African people. Once again, returning to Baba Chinwezu, yes, to explain the fact that during this period of time is also when European nations are going through the process of industrialization. Consequently, Africans, because of the education process that we went through under colonization, began to associate modernization, the development of modern civilization, with European culture. And Baba Chinwezu explains this thusly: the Europeanized African, for his part, is overwhelmed by the fantastic achievements of industrial civilization. But having accepted the European propaganda that industrial civilization is the genetic property of its European pioneers, he fails to distinguish industrial civilization as a type from European civilization or as an instance of the type. He desires the former, industrialization, so his desire for the former, industrialization, is therefore perverted into a wish to assimilate himself into the latter, European culture, civilization. Obviously, he can't resist European imperialism if he believes that Europeans are the sole owners of the paradise of industrial civilization, or that European languages, which are colonial languages in Africa, are indispensable for participation in industrial civilization. Such veneration of alien cultures leaves the African susceptible to foreign domination. Yeah, so he's saying now, even without the colonizer on the land formally colonizing the land, because of our educational process, the African thus educated is a hopeless liability. We still are not able to develop ourselves according to our own personality and culture, because we see that kind of development as synonymous with European culture. Okay, so this is explained further in the book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by a man who was formerly mentioned, Walter Rodney. And he's explaining the imposition of the European education system, specifically through the use of European languages. All right, he says the Portuguese and Spanish had always shown contempt for African language and religion. Schools of kindergarten and primary level for Africans in Portuguese colonies were nothing but agencies for the spread of the Portuguese language. Most schools were controlled by the by the Catholic Church as a reflection of the unity of the church and state in Portugal. In the little-known Spanish colony of Guinea, the small amount of education given to Africans was based on eliminating the use of local languages. Why would they want to eliminate the use of local languages? Because language is arguably the key expression of a people's culture. The language contains because language is the primary tool of communication, the language contains the primary ideas, values, and principles. Yeah, the best way to explain this is that there are words in many. Let's use African languages as an example. I speak none fluently. I know I know many words and phrases, sometimes even prayers, in a number of African languages. But I come across brothers and sisters who speak many African languages fluently. Yes, there are many words and concepts that you can't translate into English because the word or the concept is tied in with the language and the culture itself. Yes? So, getting rid of the language and imposing their language, the Portuguese language in this instance, allows them to bring with them their culture. You notice that the language or the education system was governed by the church. Okay? So, how did this affect what was produced out of the Portuguese imposed education system in Africa? Walter Rodney continues, agriculture was not carried on as scientific industry. The production of cash crops in Africa was stimulated by the minimum expenditure on the part of Europeans and with no infusion of new technology. Therefore, when educational advisors suggested agricultural education relevant to African needs, this meant no addition to African knowledge. Agriculture became an apology for a subject. Yeah, and so what he's explaining here is that the fact that they were teaching agriculture for the purpose of just creating cash crops for the benefit of European economies. Therefore, African nations were being thoroughly underdeveloped, as he says in the title of the book. Yes? Thoroughly underdeveloped. So the problem here is that, one, we have these borders that were drawn up by Europeans for their own benefit in Africa. These borders actually separated nations. Yes? So if like, say, for example, Ashanti lives here, you draw a line through that and call one, let's say Akan lives here, you draw a line through that and call one, the bottom part Ghana, and above it is Burkina Faso, yes? One's colonized by the French and one's colonized by the British, yeah, you separated the nation, okay? All right? And so since basically overthrowing colonialism, yes, in the 1950s and 60s, what hasn't happened is the overthrow of the colonial education system, which is exemplified by the fact that almost every African nation, the language of instruction, the language of education is still a European language. So if we were colonized by French, French is still the language that is spoken and taught in schools. So science and maths and so on and so forth is taught in French. If it was British, then English is the language of instruction. Okay? Still to this day in Africa. So that's a problem, yeah, coming from the same period of history, Yes. 1940s, 50s, 60s. Yes. Same period of history. Yes. That we still have today that we need to solve. So how do we solve that problem today? Well, sticking with the example of language, we have a man by the name of Baba Kwesi Pra. Kwesi Pra is the leading light in what is called the Pan-African literacy movement. Yeah, won't do too much explaining. Just gonna read, okay, and give you an example of this fantastic work. All right, you see how this solves the problem. Introduction. Kwesi Pra is launching a Pan-African literacy movement based upon clustering dialects into 12 mutually understood written languages, thus increasing access to information, reducing government costs, and enhancing ties among formerly separated communities. Kwesi's goal is to harmonize dialects into mutually understandable languages, thereby creating economies of scale in teaching and learning literacy. Kwesi's groundbreaking research reveals that 75 to 80% of all sub-Saharan Africans speak one of 12 root languages: Nguni, Soto, Tswana, Swahili, Amhara, Eastern Interlacustine, Western Interlacustine, Kitara, Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, Bambara, Fulful, Oromo, and Berber. Dialects within each root grouping are mutually intelligible. The idea is timely in the Pan-African context because of the current shift away from written colonial languages as a basic building block of an educated citizenry. Kwesi's approach will create a new kind of literacy base, linguistically uniting people who lived in different countries. For example, speakers of Be, a common root language in West Africa, would be able to communicate in writing with other native speakers in Nigeria, Benin, and Togo. Yeah, just to explain it slightly, yeah, why this is very important. First of all, we're actually, just through our understanding of our history and culture, we're reversing, yeah, an age-old stereotype of Africa and African people, be it that we are tribalist, yeah, and have all these thousands of different tribes, and Africa is disunited today because in one country you have thousands of different languages by all these different tribes, and so therefore unity can't go on because everyone speaks a different language. Yeah, but he's saying, yeah, that all of the languages of the continent are actually derived from 12 root languages that can be mutually understood if we understand the languages. So through tracing the historical and cultural lineage of the people, yeah, he is rewriting a common perception of Africa and African people. Yes? Not only is he doing that, he's actually, the purpose that it solves is, one, solving the problem of overthrowing colonial education, because they gave us the languages so that we can serve the purpose of building up European economies. Yes, so now he's saying through using our own cultural linguistic understanding, we can actually recreate economies of scale, which means that we can have languages of trade that can be used over vast areas of land, so that we can communicate better with each other. Need I say more? All right. Continuing, the problem. In Africa, hundreds of written dialects masquerade as languages, isolating communities, impeding efforts to reach literacy and reducing the range and scope of literacy's impact. Until recently, African governments had not been aware that these linguistic barriers were surmountable. They just accepted them. Thus, literacy efforts and investments have followed old colonial patterns, reinforcing these barriers without really understanding them. To get around the problem, governments have relied heavily on European written languages. For example, South Africa's government declared 11 official languages in an attempt at inclusion, but this has created enormous difficulties with the teaching, literacy, and translation costs. Kwesi asserts that the 11 languages are in fact dialects of 4 root languages. I was reasoning with 2 sisters from South Africa the other day, right? And I asked them, so how many languages do you speak? They said 7. 7. 5 of them were African languages. Sorry, 4, I think. Yeah, 4 or 5 of them were African languages, and the other 2 or 3 were European languages. Yeah, I went to Ghana. Most people I met spoke at least 2 languages. Yeah, at least 2. Many spoke 3 and understood a 4th. Yeah, mad thing. All right. Continuing. For instance, Zulu, Xhosa, Swati, Ndebele, Shangaan, Ngoni, Tumbaka, Tsenga are 85% mutually intelligible as spoken languages and all fall into the root group of Nguni. By creating a written form of Nguni, all these communities will have access to materials in their own language that is also culturally sensitive. The impact of this unification has huge implications given the history of division between, for example, South Africa's Zulu and Xhosa speaking people. It also means that groups in Tanzania, Malawi and Zambia have access to the same material since related languages are spoken in those areas, emphasizing the arbitrariness of the borders created by the colonial powers of the past. And finally, the strategy. Kwesi has demonstrated the viability of his idea by piloting it with a family of languages called Be, spoken in Nigeria, Benin, Togo, and Ghana. Kwesi has produced a new orthography for Be's mutually intelligible dialects so that all these speakers can have access to a common literature. One of the first effects of this project is that it reduced the perception of differences among the people who speak different dialects of Be. Kwesi has developed a cost-effective strategy to spread the idea of clustering dialects into common written languages by linking orthographers to governments and foreign donors. He is now taking the next step, convincing governments, international institutions and civil society to buy into this process, beginning with schools and gradually encompassing all forms of written communication coming from the government. South Africa is already producing literacy training materials on HIV, human rights, soil fertility, water, sanitation, and agriculture. Kwesi is leading donors to rethink both the content as well as the scale of literacy-oriented projects. By improving accessibility, his work will facilitate information distribution to a significantly larger percent of the population. Need I say more? So now we're seeing how a proper understanding of history can relate to solving a direct problem in today's world. That's on a very big scale, yes, but that work is being done. Yeah, so that's the proper appreciation of history. And so I put that in the presentation, yeah, to emphasize the fact that of collective memory, okay, and having an appreciation for a collective memory. And Black History Month as a celebration and an observance, if it's going to mean the most and provide the best that it can provide for people of African descent, what it must do is reinforce and highlight the aspects of our collective memory. You following me? Black can't just be, and shouldn't just be, it was not designed just to be a time of year where we boast and gloat about the great men and women of our history. That's all well and good, but it has a purpose beyond that. And the purpose that it serves beyond that is to reinforce a pride, a dignity, a purpose, and a functionality in what it means to be an African in the 21st century and beyond. I hope that you have gotten what I have presented for you today. We're going to probably do a few more live streams throughout the month of October, Black History Month in the UK. And I am hoping to do one specifically on Black history as it relates to UK activism in the UK, and possibly a few others. So do stay tuned for that. Hit that subscribe button and that bell to stay in tune with even more from ShakaRa Speaks on the YouTube. And I thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again. Have a beautiful and blessed Black History Month. Peace, blessings, and tender and worry.